Welcome to Community Faith Partners, Let's Talk Unity. Tonight, we are happy that you've joined us for the presentation of The Underground Railroad and You, presented by Dr. Gerard Aitchen. We'd like to introduce you and to present Reverend King, who will give us the framing for tonight and will also give the invocation and the introduction to Dr. Aitchen. Thank you for being with us, Reverend King.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Certainly it's good to be able to speak to the purpose of this meeting and be able to spread what is good to us, which is our history. Teacher by trade, we have to make sure that we keep continuing to share the importance of our history, because you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So I am the pastor of the St. James A.M.E. Zion Church, which is the oldest African-American congregation in Ithaca, as well as the oldest church in Ithaca, New York. St. James has been pivotal since its foundation in 1833 by Peter Webb, to be a light unto those persons in the world who are the least, the left out, and the looked over. And today we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from a wonderful person, a friend, and a professor who is, I call, the creme de la creme of Underground Railroad information and scholarship. So before we begin this program, this time of sharing, we just want to lift up just a word of prayer for all those who are here, as well as all those who wanted to come. So if we could just pause for a minute to pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this day, a day that we haven't seen before and a day that we won't see again. God, we ask that as we are assigned this time of sharing, that you just lift up our community, both locally, nationally, and internationally. This world needs you like never before. And we ask right now, Lord, that as we partake in understanding the importance of history, we celebrate the fact that we're able to know that we come from a lineage, a line cloth, a group of persons who knew for a fact that there was more than what their eyes could see and what their bodies could do, that there was faith that was there, oh Lord. So we ask you today that you just have your way in this moment of sharing, and you consecrate us to this moment for your glory. We pray and we say amen. Well, my brothers and sisters, I have the wonderful opportunity of introducing Professor Gerard Aitchen, who is a professor of Africana and Romance Studies. He specializes in 19th and 20th century Caribbean literatures and intellectual histories, theories of modernism and modernity in Latin America, and in the relation of literature, philosophy, and slavery in the Americas. He's the author of The Politics of Spanish-American Modernismo by Exquisite Design, and he's also Masking and Power, Carnival and Popular Culture in the Caribbean, and Freedom from Liberation, Slavery, Sentiment, and Literature in Cuba. Aitchen current research and teaching focuses on subjectivity and slave narratives, sugar production in the development of the modern transatlantic world, and the Underground Railroad. His Underground Railroad research project, which entails fieldwork in Central and Western New York, informs his new book project, The Promise of Rebirth, a contemporary approach to the Underground Railroad. At this time, we introduce to some and familiar to others, the person of Dr. Gerard Aitchen.
Thank you so much, Reverend King, and it's a pleasure, it's an honor to join you this evening. And what I'd like to do is take us through some of the work that we've been doing on the Underground Railroad, specifically around St. James A.M.E. Zion Church. But I just wanted to give us a sense of not only what is it that we know, what is it that we can know, where do we need to go in terms of the research, but also thinking about the relevance of this history to you, to us. So why don't I go ahead and begin that right now? I'll share my screen and then we'll go directly to a PowerPoint presentation that I have here on the Underground Railroad. So I'll go for about almost half an hour, and then we'll just have a conversation afterwards, questions, and then we'll have an exercise after that in thinking about the Underground Railroad and its relevance to you, its relevance to us. So let me start. So if we to look at this map, this is a National Geographic map of the Underground Railroad. It's a good map on the one hand because it gives us a sense of the directions that people took as they headed to Canada, to the north and to Canada. But it's not accurate in the sense, on the other hand, because it might give you the impression that these routes were constant and solid, when in fact, because of the Underground Railroad being something clandestine and people hiding, the routes were intermittent, they changed, and people would just, take the modes of transport, well, everything from walking to barges to railway to stagecoaches, in order to get to freedom. So this map is helpful in terms of directions, and we can see already that an important part of the Underground Railroad came from the area of Virginia, Maryland, and so on through Pennsylvania, crossing over to New York, Philadelphia, New York City, and then heading up our way. Another great area is, of course, the Midwest, and thinking about, Detroit, for example, is very important in terms of getting over to Canada too. So any place that had very little water between the United States and Canada was one of the areas. And so we have that in terms of Buffalo and being able to cross over to St. Catharines. There is an estimate, and we should say guesstimate, right? Between 1,000 to 5,000 freedom seekers escaping from slavery between 1830 and 1860. This is an estimate by the historian Eric Foner, who is one of our foremost historians on the subject. And you can see I say guesstimate because it's quite a large difference between 1,000 to 5,000. Again, from the beginning, I would want to emphasize that it's a guesstimate. We're trying to get a sense of the history, the documentation, and we will never have all of it, again, precisely because the activity was clandestine. 1850 was an important year in terms of the Underground Railroad. I think one of the things for us to remember is that people found ways, freedom seekers found ways to escape before the Underground Railroad. And when we think of the Underground Railroad, very often we're thinking about it as of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And what that act did was it said that slave owners or their agents could pursue and seize fugitive slaves across state lines. That was a very difficult thing for the North to swallow because, in fact, the states in the North had their own personal liberty laws, which protected people who came into their zones. But now this became a federal act that meant that it was a punishable crime, a federal crime, to assist anyone on the Underground Railroad. And some of the punishments you can see here. Anyone who assisted a fugitive could be fined no more than $1,000, which in today's currency would be about $25,000, and would be imprisoned for no more than 6 months, and was liable to pay $1,000 in civil damages for each fugitive lost. These are very important amounts, and so this was a serious criminal offense as far as the federal government was concerned. The fugitive could not testify in his or her defense, and the cases were decided without a jury. In fact, what the Fugitive Slave Act is, it created commissioners before whom freedom seekers would go, and then either the bounty hunter or the person who claims to own this person would make the case. And these commissioners would decide if these claims were true or not. Now, the sources of documentation that we have, as you can imagine, are quite a range, because they would go from academic historians who, like Eric Foner, who do publish important work based on the archives. And then you have county historians. For example, in the state of New York, there's a county historian in every county, I believe. And so in our areas of central New York and western New York, you have people whose job it is to sort of compile this information. So if any of you, are interested in finding out more from your county historians, I think they're very approachable and would welcome the interest. There are also history centers and museums throughout the region. And then a sort of an untapped area, the owners of houses that had been on the Underground Railroad. These are people who today live in what might have been former Quaker homes or other places where there were hiding places for freedom seekers going north. And so there are people today who have stories, or their ancestors, relatives have told them stories about the houses in which they live. And we don't have a full sense of that because, again, it's very fragmented. And people weren't going to divulge that information again, because according to the Fugitive Slave Act, any sort of assistance would have been a crime, punishable crime. And then there are interested citizens all around who collect this information, are fascinated about this information, and so on. So that you would get, for example, a typical sort of important archival work done by John Hope Franklin, one of the foremost historians of the experience of slavery in the United States, and Lauren Schwenninger, who point out in this text, Runaway Slaves, that running away wasn't always, obviously, to the Underground Railroad. Running away could mean anything from a few hours to a few days to a nearby plantation, to a nearby town, and sometimes return, sometimes not. So we have to have a sense of running away in this very broad sense before we can appreciate exactly what the Underground Railroad itself is, which is a form of running away, but not all people escaping the plantations use the Underground Railroad. To give you another example of another source of information we have from William Still, who was Underground Railroad station agent in Philadelphia. If you've seen the Harriet Tubman movie, he's the one to whom she brings freedom seekers. And what he did was he kept an account of some of their names, where they came from, how they made it there, and so on. And that was, again, very dangerous. This is a text that he would hide away. And it's one of the only ones that we have that sort of records this information. And it's a text that is important for those families who, wanted to find their loved ones, who had escaped at a different time, a different period. So this was a way for people to sort of locate their family as well. Eric Foner, as I mentioned before, is one of the foremost historians on the Underground Railroad, especially in the New York area, New York City, and is a very important researcher in this area. He points out very clearly that the Underground Railroad, at the heart of it, is what is called the vigilance committees that were to be found in the cities, for example, but also in the rural areas. And these are people who watched out for freedom seekers, helped them go from safe house to safe house, and then up to Canada, whatever the means of transportation, hid them, fed them, and so on. So those, he gives us a great account of how it worked in New York City, and so on. And sometimes, to realize that New York City was also had very important pro-slavery organizations, because the trade with the South in cotton was very important commercially for New York City. So the more that you came into our areas, into central New York and western New York, you get a heavier abolitionist support, but not only, because they were also pro-slavery sort of groups up here as well. Harriet Tubman is her life and the ways in which she maneuvered through the spaces where she was born in Maryland and up to our area here for Auburn and Canada and so on is very well documented. This is probably one of the most detailed histories of Harriet Tubman and all the activities of her family and so on. And you get a real sense of what it took to create the ways in which people could escape north. And this author is Kate Clifford Larson, very often consulted for films and documentaries and so on. And then you have people who just decided that they wanted to investigate this themselves, like Tom Calarco, who wrote this Underground Railroad in upstate New York, just going to, again, speaking with county historians, librarians, looking at newspapers. And so you have private citizens who have this interest too. Most recently, we have an archaeologist by the name of Cheryl LaRoche, who has done a book called Free Black Communities and the Underground Railroad. This book is called, The Geography of Resistance. Both Eric Fona, the historian, and Cheryl LaRoche they emphasize a very important point, is that very often we have the information about the Underground Railroad that have come from abolitionists, very often white abolitionists, who were able to write about certain aspects of abolitionism, not necessarily, what was going on at the Underground Railroad, because everybody knew this was, again, a secret code that had to be used and clandestine activity. So they weren't going to divulge that sort of information. But I think what both Eric Fona and Cheryl LaRoche say is that we have to pay attention to the communities, the Black communities, the congregations, who were doing this work, and then that history is not really recorded. That is one of the important things for us as well when we are working very closely with St. James EME Zion Church, to listen to the oral histories, to what we understand people have said about the activities around the church. And this is one example, because just generally thinking about the Black churches, and in the case of the EME Zion denomination to be known during the 19th century as the Freedom Church, it makes all the sense in the world to be thinking about their contributions to the Underground Railroad and to abolitionism as well. Then there is to give you another example of another source, there is a thesis, a master's thesis done by a student from Cornell in 1903, was when he defended the thesis, Albert Cook Wixom, and that's available at the Olin Library at Cornell University. So as I said, we've tried to sort of concentrate some of our work around the St. James EME Zion Church. Reverend King has already told us about the importance of the church, but then we also know it to be the central Underground Railroad station in Ithaca, New York. And so our work has definitely been there, and thinking about the people who were there, who came there, who, in the case of Frederick Douglass, who gave a speech there in 1852, and also Harriet Tubman's visits through the area on her way up to Auburn, for example. So these are important figures who we know in terms of abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, who have made St. James EME Zion Church a very important site in that struggle for freedom, lending their services, lending their activism toward that goal. And so one of the things that we're doing in terms of our projects is, given the fact that this has sort of become an important partnership with St. James, for example, on the one hand, we have an approach where we're trying to understand that experience of being on the Underground Railroad. What must it have been like? We ask that question because we don't have documentation. We have very little documentation that details the kind of experience that could have been. So on the one hand, by having an excavation, an archaeological excavation, which was begun in Ithaca at St. James Church this summer, then we're able to sort of bring together science and history on the one hand to try and understand some of this experience, and on the other, thinking about creative writing and history. So when we don't have the documentation of the Underground Railroad, then we turn to some of our writers as well, who are thinking about what that must have been like. So we're trying to approach, on the one hand, when we think of the science and history and archaeology, we're thinking of the material evidence that we can find of daily life around the church in St. James Church, for example, in the 19th century. And hopefully we would find, some evidence of Underground Railroad activity, but that's not assured necessarily. I think it's what we have to remember is the fact that the church is present and is there, and it would have been one of the first places to be searched. So obviously, if it's the kind of central station that is already, sending off freedom seekers to different homes in the neighborhood, and so that makes a lot more sense. So that hiding places might be very much so in the neighborhood. And then thinking about creative writing, we've put together a website that maps some of these places, mostly rumored places, oral histories about the Underground Railroad. And so my students, what they've done is, after reading the classic slave narratives, for example, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Solomon Northup, for example, in 12 Years a Slave, they read these texts, they read the histories of the Underground Railroad, and specifically Eric Foner's and Kate Clifford Larson on Harriet Tubman. And then they get to write about 5 pages of a narrative where they put themselves in the position of somebody traveling on the Underground Railroad. I think going forward, we're also going to be looking at the ways in which we want narratives as well from people who they imagined assisted others on the Underground Railroad. In both cases, definitely these are exercises of empathy, but they're very difficult exercises, the students have told me. And so I'll give you examples of both of these things as we go forward here. Now, I'll give you an example. Here is just about 3 minutes that explains something about the excavation at St. James. And it's important, and you will see towards the end of it, a reference is made to, you think that archaeology, and you would be correct in thinking that archaeology, what it's doing is giving us a sense of material that have been historically laid there in layers. But as one of the archaeologists says, just the work of doing this archaeology creates community. So I think this is something for us to remember. So I'll let you listen to this and get a sense of what's being done at St. James.
Historically, this church has been a stop on the Underground Railroad, and it has also been the community meeting spot of activists and abolitionists throughout the history of that season and that time.
What archaeology does is it slowly peels back the layers of time. So we start where we are today, and we go back slowly through the 20th century into the 19th century. And so it's no longer just telling the story of the Underground Railroad, but it really became more broadly encompassing about how we tell the story of this congregation and this church over the course of 150, 170 years here in Ithaca, and the role that the institution has played in making this town and this community.
What archaeology offers to the study of this period is a really up-close look at the practices of everyday life. And so, you can see here some of the artifacts we found so far include ceramics, some glass, iron nails. All of these artifacts are important because in one way or another, they can help us tell stories of everyday life at the church.
One of the things that's been inspiring about the project is the first time I took students to the site,
They came out so full of curiosity and wonder, and it sort of sparked a kind of historical imagination.
There's something about kinesthetically being involved in certain things, moving and digging, and I think this excavation adds that other mode of learning. For St. James and Cornell to build that connection, that collaboration, here you now have the work beyond the pages of the book. It's about there, you can see all the trees? Yeah.
So it's not just that we're revealing the history of this community. I've actually met people that I never would have met if we didn't start this project. People come down the sidewalks and check in with us each week and see what else we found, and they've now become new associates and new friends.
When somebody finds something, we're all like very supportive about it and sharing that we're trying to give each other that joy of finding something big.
I think that this is what's so particularly entrancing about archaeological research is that it doesn't just explore a community, it builds one at the same time.
Scott, there you go. Thank you. Let's give it a 5.
I just wanted to say that this project itself started, we did it for the first time towards the end of the summer, so from mid-September to mid-November. And the teams consisted of Cornell students as well as young students from the Ithaca community. So we did that for the first time. We're looking to plan a second excavation to begin that conversation about what that would look like next summer. And so we're very pleased with how this whole sort of community archaeology has gone. The other thing that I wanted to share is the website that I mentioned, which we've called Voices on the Underground Railroad. And so what we've done is we just have about 9 stories that students, for the moment, because we have more to come up, it takes quite a while to go from the actual story, because what happens is my students would write the stories and then they would be given over to students at the Milstein program in technology and humanity, which is a special undergraduate program at Cornell. And these students worked on the website, enhancing the website. They did the sound effects. And then the texts themselves would be given over to actors from the Civic Ensemble Theater Group in Ithaca. So they would do the voices in most of these cases. And so the stories were mapped onto the site. So we have the stories here. And the one I'd like you to listen to is of the Seward House. This is the William Henry and Frances Seward House in Auburn. If you don't know, Seward himself was the governor of New York State. He's also the senator of New York and had been the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. Most people remember him for, the Alaska purchase. And so he's a very important abolitionist. In his home, there's documentation that it was on the Underground Railroad. And some of this documentation has to do with correspondence with his wife, Frances. So the Sewards, especially Frances, was important as well for facilitating the sale of the land on which Harriet Tubman built her house there in Auburn as well. So very strong abolitionists. And what you're going to hear is a story that was created by a student from one of my courses, one of my seminars, who went to the Seward House, did the research, and then wrote this kind of fictional correspondence between Frances Seward and a freedom seeker by the name of John, who had passed through on the way to Canada. So it's well researched, but then it also asks us to be thinking about, what might it have been like to be traveling on the Underground Railroad. Now, I wanted to play this one in particular because our exercise as well will be that, to try collectively to imagine what that experience would have been like for John, the person you'll be hearing. So we can listen now.
Voices on the Underground Railroad. William and Frances Seward House, 33 South Street, Auburn, New York. In a letter from Frances Seward to her husband William Henry Seward, dated October 16, 1851, she writes, "Two fugitives have gone to Canada. One of them was our acquaintance John." This letter can be found in the Seward Family Digital Archive. It is accompanied by a note from the archive editors stating that the identity of the freedom seeker John is unknown to historians. The author of the following story has imagined John as a freedman living in New York for 7 years before being driven off to flight again with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In this scenario, his mother, wife, and children went ahead to make arrangements and then sent for John, who continued to work in New York until his family had settled in Canada. Upon passing through New York State, he stayed a night in the Seward home, where he was warmly welcomed by Frances Seward and her children. The two agreed to stay in contact as he worked to reunite with his family in Canada. Informed by archival research and local historical contexts, the voices you will hear imagine the correspondences that could have passed between them.
Friday, October 24th, 1851. Dear Mrs. Seward, by God's grace, I can finally say I am no longer a fugitive. I have much on my mind and much to attend to today, but I found a moment to send you a brief few lines. I'm writing with the happy news that we arrived last morning in Ontario. With much gratitude for your aid in helping me and my acquaintance in the final leg of our journey through New York. I would be pleased if you would pass our profound thanks to your family as well. I will write to you about my journey now as a free man, living as God intended. I'm fortunate to be staying with a lawyer in town who has helped many fugitives before me by offering shelter and helping them locate their families who have crossed prior. He kindly offered to post this letter to you. I anticipate I will not have a chance to write again for many days. Until then, may God bless you. Most obediently, John.
Thursday, October 30th, 1851. Dear John, I received your letter notifying me that you arrived in Canada on Monday. How happy I was to hear this news. I have prayed that you would have no more troubles on the perilous journey through New York. How was the lake crossing? Did you chance to find the port I suggested, or did you have to find another way across? I am certain it was a cold and frightening journey, and I am thanking God that you have made it to the other side. You now stand on the ground of a nation that sees all men as God does, free and equal. I anxiously await word that you have made contact with your family. Please do write if you believe we could help in locating them. Mr. Seward has many connections across the border and a great number of friends. Fanny is feeling quite well today and asked when we might have guests stay in the old kitchen again. Just yesterday, she asked after you and the others as well. I was glad to share your happy news with her. She seemed to enjoy reading to you in the evening and bringing you vegetables from the kitchen upstairs. I was joyed to see her so active during your stay. I am happy that you were able to move through Auburn safely despite the heightened agitation around the rescue of a man called Jerry from jail in Syracuse. We are all awaiting news on the trial over which Judge Conkling will preside. I have no great confidence in the judge, and it is said that the prosecution is holding firm. Still, I pray the judge treats the defendants favorably. May God protect you today and always. Respectfully, Frances Seward.
Thursday, November 20th, 1851. Dear Mrs. Seward, I was happy to receive a letter from you early last week. My work with the lawyer has kept me busy as we continue to search for my family. I'm grateful for your continued interest in my cause, and I received your letter with profound joy. Your warm hearth and gentle spirit were a bright moment in the dark and treacherous months of my flight. Having lived 7 years as a free man in New York City, it still troubles me to think I may have been stolen back into slavery with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act. For the colored population of America, it seems that freedom is still a dream, never to be realized. I cannot understand why a nation built under the grace of God can continue to operate with the devil's hand and not recognize the humanity and the wretched man upon whose backs and with whose hands this nation was most certainly built. I am very invested in the case of the rescue of the man Jerry from jail. What news of the trial? It is hard for me to imagine that in an abolitionist state like New York, they might still deny this man's right to freedom. God save Queen Victoria, on whose soil I now stand free and unafraid. I have many friends who plan to leave New York as it becomes more and more dangerous for the colored man in the North. It is thanks to gentle folks like you that they have a chance at making it to freedom. I will write again when I have more news of my family. Please keep us in your prayers and may God bless you. Most obediently, John.
The correspondence between Francis Seward and John was read by Jessica Ness
and Bertrand Odom Reed.
Good. So I will stop share now, and then we can continue in conversation. Happy to engage in that conversation and answer any questions that I can.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was inspiring and just riveting information, Dr. H. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and I know we spoke it was a couple of months ago when we were on the archaeological site, but I wanted to ask you, what is, or is there any value in doing an archaeological site on what was once a part of the Underground Railroad?
I think the value for us is twofold. We can look back at a particular history that's important to the nation. And, just thinking about that, the ways in which that activity, was one of the first times in which you had a multiracial America, that is to say, people who are working together in abolitionism, on the Underground Railroad. So we have a kind of a blueprint for how things worked, how things, didn't work, what worked, what failed, in the past. So I think those things become very important as we look today when we think of, for example, when we think of alliances that we have, across many sectors, many different communities, and today to just also be thinking about, who makes a good ally, what is the nature of that alliance. So in a sense, we have that. I think it's important for us not to romanticize the Underground Railroad, right? As I say, there was that important activity, but there were ways in which things didn't work either in terms of those alliances. So again, even as I say, it's a blueprint for how things worked, there were also examples of how things didn't work. And I think that's an honest way to approach, just thinking about alliances and the importance of questions of freedom, especially when you have a law that was federal. And just most recently with my students, I've been saying we have to be able to decipher between what is a law and what is moral, because they don't necessarily coincide. And it definitely was the case with with slavery, that it didn't, and so And even when you have something like the Fugitive Slave Act, which there were many people who, not only because of what they risked in terms of, being charged or being thrown into prison, but just felt that, that they wouldn't be part of it simply because it was a law that was federal. And they I suppose they believed in the system. They believed in their politicians were doing right. But then there were others who were saying, like even, William Henry Seward himself, that said, there is a higher law, So that was one of the things he said, which is, of course, a kind of a dangerous thing to say as a politician,
Right.
But as somebody who's thinking about the, sort of, his own soul and the morality of a nation, then it becomes a valid question. So I think we keep those. We can't separate that history from some of the questions that are the value of asking ourselves some of those things still today.
Thank you. And I want to ask Reverend King, you're the pastor of a historic church. What is the responsibility that you feel that you and your congregants have in being a part of such rich history?
Dissertation question, right? Being one of the youngest pastors to the church's history, I believe that our mission is in tandem with kind of what Cornell is doing, to understand and tell persons the stories that exist within the church that are not tangible, that we can't actually read and reference. St. James and his congregation are a plethora of information from people who have walked through the doors of the church that isn't published. So as the pastor, one, I want to make sure that I hone in on the stories that my congregation knows. And two, most importantly, is to share it with the world and the denomination and the students that come. It's so funny that, once I got my appointment, I told my son that, hey, I'm a pastor of a church that's part of the Underground Railroad. And, to him, it was only on the pages of a book. But to actually see that there's actual, and, he was voluntold to participate in the excavation, by the way. So for him to actually get on his knees and dig and feel the earth under his nail and find, what they could find on the property, a light went off in his head, and he was like, this was awesome. This is awesome. It was affirmation for him. Like, it's beyond the pages of the book, as I said in the video. So my job as a pastor is, again, just to do that, continue to tell our story and to let the world know, the denomination know, that St. James is looking forward to 190 years next year, and we're going for another 190 after.
Great. That's wonderful response, Reverend King. And back to you, Dr. H. And I'm curious to know, we talk about the Underground Railroad, and we talk about the Black enslaved people who escaped. Is there documentation to show that there was ever a time when some of the underground sympathizers were actually imposters and they actually recaptured slaves? Or is that not, not happen?
Yes, that's a good question, because I know in the case of in Sherwood, New York, which is just about 25 minutes north of here, there is a museum called the Howland Stone Store Museum. And it's an important museum because of the Quaker family that was there and their participation in abolition, and also their participation in helping with the Underground Railroad. And it's a site where I took students, and they have an Underground Railroad ticket, right? Now, clearly you ask, well, why would you need a ticket, right? Because the Underground Railroad is sort of coded language, for all the escape routes and so on. And so why would you need a ticket? And so the explanation that there is that the person carrying the ticket shows that, this is a real freedom seeker. This is not, somebody who is trying to be part of capturing, people who were assisting on the Underground Railroad. So I have no idea how widespread those tickets were. It's the only one that I know of, but they actually do have a copy of it that they are very happy to show. But the activity of pursuing freedom seekers were undertaken by slave owners, as well as people who they deputized to do it, bounty hunters and so on that would come into this region. And it creates an economy, because even people, up in the north who might take advantage if this person looks like a runaway, let's go after him, because they're already thinking of this person as a source of income, right? Because there are rewards out for runaways. And so you would have occasions in which, as well, some people would try to fool the authorities, saying that, no, this person is the person on this poster that we have, not poster, but this, announcement of runaway. So there were all sorts of ways in which people were doing underhanded things, in which to capture. But it created an economy all the way, for example, in Buffalo, just going over to St. Catharines was where many bounty hunters gathered, knowing that was the route over, So there are lots of stories about that. So, but I don't know of any sort of stories of people trying to use subterfuge to sort of arrest people who were helping. But I think it's significant that there was such a thing as an Underground Railroad ticket, to verify to the people helping that this is legitimate. This is a legitimate freedom seeker.
Oh, fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I'm curious about, and I'm going to ask if both of you would answer this. We talk about the history of the Underground Railroad. We talk about Black history during the month of February. Do you think that there is a need to have this conversation year long? And what are the benefits of having an ongoing conversation about Black history and the history of these United States?
Reverend King, would you like to start?
I defer to you, sir.
Okay. Yes, I think it is important for us to take time, the month of February, to think about these things, to actually say, this is a decision we're going to do. But the importance of what we share and think about in February goes beyond, it goes to the entire year. Because one of the things that we learn about the Underground Railroad is that when a freedom seeker goes through it, generally there is this elation at the end that says, I am free. It comes with sadness at the same time. It's bittersweet because these are people who have decided to leave family and friends behind. So it's never, a sentiment of just jubilation purely, right? That is something that's significant, thinking about, the kinship ties that are broken, and so you have cases in which, for example, in Frederick Douglass, he speaks about something that he calls the tender point. When he says the tender point, he says it's the one thing that almost made him not leave when he escaped to Maryland. And that's the thought of his friends and family, right? So he makes it very clear that it is a rational decision that he's coming through, that he's reasoned out, should he leave or should he not, right? And he does not look down on those people who decide to stay because they are staying for family and friends. Now imagine that, right? The possibility of becoming or understanding or obtaining some sort of freedom at the expense, at the cost of leaving family behind. That is something to keep thinking about when you're thinking about kinfolk and families and so on. That's something that's still relevant to think of all year. The other important part is when somebody goes through the Underground Railroad and becomes free, it's not absolute freedom, because there is still a claim on your body by somebody that's allowed by the system, right? And so you either have to settle into areas, keep hiding, change your name, definitely, right? Find whatever livelihood that's important. But I think all of that and the years afterward remind us that, yes, the Underground Railroad offers some sort of freedom, but the struggle for equality remains. It was then, and it is now. Right. So I think that's what we need to be thinking about all year.
From my point of view, we have to understand that Black history is American history. And there is no separate for the two. They are synonymous with one another. And given this state and climate, with what I deem an attack on scholarship, to really educate and continue to educate our youth about the role of African American and other races in our country, it is even more important that we, beyond February, still explore the Underground Railroad, the contributions of those who, quote unquote, are minorities. And it's important, and it adds, no pun intended, it adds color to our story. So Black history is American history, and yes, it should not just be relegated to just 1 month, but it also should be relegated throughout the year, because it's important for us to really understand as a society where we have been and where we are facing and what are we going towards. So,
very well said. Thank you, Reverend King. And now we're going to allow you, the audience, our listeners, to jump in on the conversation and ask our wonderful guests questions. But before we do that, Dr. Achen has an exercise that he would like to present.
I think probably we could do both things at the same time, think about the questions and so on, given the time that we have. And I had asked everyone to listen to that correspondence, those voices in the correspondence between someone who's, Francis Seward and John, right? Just to listen to that, to the issues of the day. And just for us to be thinking about what would the experience have been like to have been on the Underground Railroad? What are the sentiments? What are the risks taken? Sort of what are the emotions as somebody is going through the Underground Railroad? What might their thoughts be? If we could imagine ourselves doing that, what's coming to our minds as we think about that journey? So that's what I wanted to open up to us all, for us to think about that. Just what thoughts come to your mind, just thinking about it, or in assisting somebody on the Underground Railroad. But in both cases, there are different kinds of risks involved. And if we could think about that for a minute and then, pursue some questions along those lines, that would be wonderful.
And while you're thinking about that, I'll ask you if you'd like to pose your questions in the Q&A. Feel free to do that. And also, if anyone has a question that you feel would be better asked live and from your own voice, just raise your hand and I'll promote you to the forum here, and you can feel free to ask it. So as we think about what the professor has just led us into, I'd like to read a question that came in while we were talking earlier. And this is from Elaine. And it reads, I'm assuming that at least one podcast will come out of this. Maybe with the authors of the imagined accounts reading their essays. What will be the format, and who is most likely to be who is most likely to be the or what is most likely to be the format? And then it goes on to say, will Negro spirituals from the period be used for background to reinforce themes in these accounts? So I don't know who wants to answer this, the professor or the reverend.
So I'm not sure what podcasts. I mean, if it's a suggestion that we undertake some podcasts, that would be interesting. But I don't know if it was a reference to the website either, because the different stories there, they sound like podcasts. They're actually, roughly 8-12 minutes long. So you can actually explore those there. And in the case of these are students on our website who don't give, because of FERPA, we don't reveal their identities. Their identities have to be protected, and they have used pseudonyms, in order to present the stories. And so that's in terms of what we've done with the website, But thinking about podcasts, I mean, that's another possibility, for someone to undertake. It would be fantastic. We're also building with respect to the spirituals. We haven't used any for our website, but there is that possibility, I think. What's also happening is we're creating right now a 3D model of St. James Church that has attached that model storytelling that is coming both from Reverend King, members of the congregation, the trustees, also the archaeologists, myself, to give a sense of the history and the value of what's there, and to try and guide people virtually through the experience of going through that history, St. James. And we are in the process right now of adding some spirituals to that particular site. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
And we have a question coming in from Jeffrey Hart, and he says, my thoughts are around, what do those on the journey anticipate freedom to actually be and or mean, given the emotional dilemma that exists, elation and or sadness?
I think that's the kind of question we can open up and all try to approach. Because again, we don't have that documentation. We have to try and imagine what that would be. The immediate thing I think of is to no longer be listening to that bell that wakes you up every morning, or the sound of that whip to wake you up in the morning for you to go. That's the first thing. You are completely away from the daily life of the plantation, and the amount of courage that it takes to leave the plantation, because you're being told by the slave owners that the North is awful, you're going to be destitute, you're going to starve to death. They try to scare people into not going north. So you have to overcome that. And that's the sort of psychological part, not to even speak of the physical, sort of difficulty of just getting, across the to Pennsylvania or New York or Ohio, things like that. So it's a tremendous undertaking, a great deal of courage.
So here enters the church, St. James AME Zion Church. Historically, beyond its founded in 1833, the pastors who were at the helm of this church would encourage slave owners to allow their slaves to come to service, to worship. So when he mentioned freedom, I thought, well, may not be physical freedom, it may not be mental freedom, but there was spiritual freedom in that time. That's why the church was so profound. It was the meeting place of the people. And there is documentation that says pastors promised slave owners that I'm gonna do everything I can to make sure that your slave comes back, as long as you allow them to come back to church on Sunday. So even in that, the spiritual freedom that those slaves sought after in this area actually kind of got them through the literal bondage that they were going through slavery.
Excellent point, Reverend. And we have Pastor Chuck Tompkins here. I've promoted him to come and join the panel. He had his hands raised. So Chuck, if you want to go ahead and you can show your video or you can just speak.
I tried to show my video, Lisa, but it says you blocked me from my video.
Oh, okay. Try it now.
No, you cannot start your video. The host has stopped it, but that's all right.
Okay.
I just want to thank the professor and my brother Terrence for this evening. It's just been super informative and just very visceral for us to enter into this history. Honestly, when you pose the question, which is an emotional question of how do you think the fugitives or our Black brothers felt, what goes through your imagination? The first thought that came to my mind is like me trying to tell a woman what it's like to give birth. I don't have a clue. I find myself almost emotionally distant, just trying to understand all the emotions and the fears and the anxieties and the separations and just the horrific conditions. But anyway, it's a great question, and it really forced me to enter into the emotion of that era of history with shame and with just shaking my head. But two questions. One is probably easier than the second. The first is, how did a Black brother or sister know what was a safe place and a safe person on their journey? And the second question is, I was intrigued by your comments about Seward as he stepped out of line with his contemporaries as a politician, as a leader. What do you think gave him the moral courage to take that risk and to do what he did and to speak as he spoke?
Just in terms of thinking about travelers on the Underground Railroad, I also sort of following up from Reverend King's comment, but also of the importance of the church, but also wanting to think about the emotional weight of going through the Underground Railroad. If on the one hand, the person who is enslaved understands that he or she has no control over his life, that at any any moment the auction block decides that, you go from that is the biggest fear, because that's what split families, right? So that we can understand. Now imagine that same person who is afraid of that putting himself or herself in the hands of complete strangers, along the way in the Underground Railroad, which included the churches, people that had never been known in regions they had no idea where they were. Completely, there's a sense of faith in the goodness of these people in order to get them around. So you have these mixed emotions of, yes, fear and worry, but at the same time, believing that that through the Underground Railroad you and the people working there, you would be able to get to safety. Because I mean, you would have to. There were people who would leave and understand that if you were to come across somebody who still uses the word thou, who is white, you can trust, because these were Quakers, right? So there were little codes like that, hints like that along the way that allowed people to trust. And of course, since enslaved people were also religious people, I mean, they would look to the church, they would look to the Black churches that were in existence for that assistance, so there were definitely, ways in which to sort of allay those fears and just move on, and put yourself in the hands of the people who are showing you kindness, who are showing you hiding places, feeding you. It is the case that in the Black congregations, the women would collect a penny a week and add there was food, that was, clothing, to help people going north. And just in terms of the question about Seward, again, a Quaker background, religious understanding that, slavery was immoral, but also being a very powerful person who, on the one hand, could be in Washington and be in, the highest areas of government, but at the same time, be practicing the Underground Railroad in his house. Now, he had the wherewithal that nobody was going to, I think, arrest him, right? Or I didn't know, how they would have found out or whatever, but he was strongly abolitionist, as many people in Central and Western New York were fervid abolitionists. And there was also a political party that was just founded on being anti-slavery. So that was the fervor, in our part of it. So it was very clear to them that slavery was immoral, and they had to do everything possible, to get rid of it.
Thank you for that response. And we have a question from the viewers, and it reads, for Lisa and panelists, as residents of the Ithaca area, how has exploring the history of the Underground Railroad in the upstate New York region changed your thinking about living here, about the landscapes you see, about the way you move around upstate New York? How would you like your thoughts and experience to change more? Excellent question from Rebecca. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for that. Would either of you like to answer that?
Sure. I find myself taking a deep breath. I mean, for me, to come to St. James via Syracuse, the irony is that Syracuse is also a stop on the Underground Railroad, as People's Amy Zion Church is there as well. Bishop Jermaine Logan, who was also a major influence on the Underground Railroad. I kind of answer this question with what history has told us juxtaposed to where we are now. I find that not even just myself, I really question the constituents of Ithaca, the constituents of Syracuse, and anybody within the walls and the reach of these wonderful historic sites, if they really understand the magnitude of what they represent and what they speak to. There's a song you may know back in the day, smiling in your face all the while trying to take your place, backstabbers. So we want to make sure that, if we have allies and persons who really believe in the forward moving and documentation of the Underground Railroad, that we also mirror that in today's world. So when we still see the injustices taking place to our Black brothers and sisters in Syracuse, in Ithaca, it makes me pause to really understand, if we really understand where we are today, and if there is power in understanding the Underground, do we really understand what it represented, how we are trying as hard as we can to make sure that we are not repeating history, not literally, but figuratively as it relates to the bondage on our minds, on our political systems, on the church, and on our people.
Thank you for that, Reverend King. Now, of course, my path to Ithaca was different. I came here to study. I was a graduate student here. Then after graduating from Cornell, then I went to the New York City area and then came back here in 2009. Working on the Underground Railroad has just, how should I put it, revolutionized my work. I've been trained as in literature and history, in the 19th century, yes, but in the Caribbean area. I'm originally from Trinidad. So my work has been on looking at that particular history on plantations within the Caribbean, where obviously there was no Underground Railroad. And so being here, I just looked around at our landscape and just began doing the research. I started teaching a course, and then it just slowly built up to what is happening now. And I realized that this is one of the histories on the landscape of Ithaca. The others include women's suffrage, the dispossession of the indigenous peoples. There could be some interesting work done on religion, different religions within, because this was the burnt over district, for example, so in terms of music, there's so many sort of histories on this landscape that is just fascinating and important. And I think, we can drive through and just see the landscape, but do we really see the landscape? So when you think of the histories that were so important here, the living histories, and realizing that we just have fragments all around us, walking down the street, who lived here? Was this a hiding space? Was this person a suffragist? All of these things become relevant and bring that history alive. And so I have found, not just myself, but various colleagues and so on. So I find myself, introducing people to the landscape around us on campus, so that now there is a kind of momentum in terms of interest from colleagues and students about just going out into our area and understanding this history, because in a sense, Cornell came about in the midst of that history, in 1865, yes, after the Civil War. But women's suffrage was important, and an important part of that political and cultural atmosphere as well. And recent, emancipation, so all of those things were informing the creation of the institution, So I see that as my role, but it's really one that is dynamic and gives me a lot of energy, and more projects, and more possibilities to be speaking with groups of people interested like yourselves, so it's been, I said, revolutionizing for the way I think about my work, but also the ways in which I am part of my community.
Wow, I love both your answers. And as a newcomer, I still consider myself a newcomer to this area. For me, it's really like walking around a living museum. There is so much history here that whenever I'm out and about in the area, my mind is constantly thinking, and I'm actually asking myself those questions. Professor, what was it like? Whose house was this 150 years ago, 200 years ago? The first time that I stepped foot in St. James AME Zion, the pastor then was the Reverend Paris Price, and she gave me a tour. I was literally, I could not speak. I felt like the place that I was standing on was sacred ground. She began to tell me about Harriet Tubman coming there and Frederick Douglass, and I'm just standing in awe. So I consider myself, I consider it really a privilege to live in this region with all of the history. I've been to Auburn several times, been to the Harriet Tubman house, the center that they have there. It's I think it's an honor to live in this region and to experience the history as we do. And I'm just wanting to learn as much as I can while I'm here in this region. And I really enjoyed being at the archaeological site and just interacting with Dr. Achen and all of the wonderful things that you were telling us. So I feel like I can't get enough of this history. So that was an excellent question, Rebecca. Thank you so much for asking. We are running out of time, and as always, we have many more questions. So let me see if I can get to a few more before we finish. Someone just posted very insightful responses. Thank you. Someone else asked, I am thinking the enslaved freedom seekers embraced this scripture that hopefully they were taught, ? Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the A, substance of things hoped for, B, the evidence of things not seen, for by it the elders obtained a good testimony. So that's a very thoughtful response. From Dr. McAllister, she asks, how has studying the Underground Railroad affected and or informed your faith? So if both of you like to answer that question, you're welcome to.
I can take a go at it. So St. James, thankfully, is an eclectic congregation. I have, Black and white and, other identities that persons represent and call themselves. Since really getting this appointment and meeting, Dr. Atching and other persons in the church, I felt like I needed to be learned about the Underground Railroad. Obviously, there's not enough books I can read that I'll be on Dr. Atching's level, but I humble myself enough to have a great foundation of it. But as it relates to the pulpit, no matter who is in the congregation, I still speak truth to power about what I represent. And I don't take it lightly, and I'm humbled that I get to mount the pulpit where distinguished persons have preached God's word. So there is no editing of God's word. There is no coddling of feelings. And my congregation knows that, and my visitors know that. So I think as a faith believer, studying the Underground Railroad has given me even more power and more audacity to challenge and to bring up critical issues that are related to today, but also reflect the fact that I'm standing on shoulders of great giants who wouldn't have it any other way, that I should also speak the word of God, as well as convict the people who are watching me as to what is right, what is wrong, and what should be freedom.
Thank you, Reverend King. So the experience, I would like to emphasize a word that Reverend King has used, which is humility. You come into contact with these stories, you try and imagine, and you have to be humble. You are humbled by the experience, or what you imagine the experience to be. And you all keep calling me professor, and okay, granted, there's a certain credential, a certain amount of training that comes with that, and I'm happy to accept the title, but it doesn't mean that I have all the answers, right? And so to approach this experience of learning about the Underground Railroad and being humble about it means you put yourself in a position to listen and to learn. and the kinds of things that I learn and ask myself, in contrast to thinking of the experience of escaping on the Underground Railroad, I end up asking, well, what is a good life on the one hand, right? What constitutes a good life? What are the elements that go into that? Especially when you're seeing the way that people strive to be able to enjoy a good life in freedom, right? You have to you invariably ask yourself that question. I mean, that's been my case. And the other part of it too is also when we think, how can we, a measure of the goodness of our society also depends on how we treat the least privileged, right? So that in fact, how you treat other fellow human beings, is a measure, right, of your openness to the good life. And so all of those thoughts come to me when I think about the experience. And so I as much as I don't have documentation, and I've taken down the Hebrews 11:1. I mean, that is fantastic because it speaks both about substance and faith, and that went directly to what I was, at my point towards the end of my presentation. So yes, see, it's good to be humble and listen. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This has been certainly an enjoyable, informative discussion. And we're getting down to the time that we'll need to close out. But before we go, I would like to ask if both of you could leave us with closing thoughts, and however you'd like to frame it. Who would like to speak first? Okay, thank you, Reverend King.
Closing thoughts. St. James AME Zion Church is just a small puzzle piece of an even bigger tapestry of geography. My goal as pastor is to make sure that we continue to do our best at telling the story of those past, present, and future. And it's no mistake that now that the church's logo, slogan, mantra is historic, his story, his people, which ties into not only our historic significance, but the story of who Jesus Christ is, and the fact that his people both has connotations to the Underground Railroad significance and the continued perpetuation of the forward movement of God's people today. So I just leave with this thought that St. James is here to stay, here to share its story, and here to be viable in this new age, and let the world know that there is something really about the Underground Railroad.
I will continue on that note about there is something about the Underground Railroad. I have noticed the way in which the fascination, the curiosity about it is already a step toward understanding a particular human experience, an understanding, a striving for a better world, right? And so I've been fascinated myself about people, all age groups, all colors, all economic, just asking, just wanting to know more about it. And I cannot account for that, the breadth and depth of that curiosity. I just know that there's something there that allows us to try and understand a particular human experience. If we can have empathy, if we can allow ourselves to imagine that experience, I think it will help us to ask questions not only about that particular moment, but also about the paths that we're on. And I think there is great value in that. So, the final thought would be just to invite you who are listening to just be one of the people who, can share in that fascination and curiosity, not just for the sake of fascination and curiosity, because it's pretty open-ended. As I was saying when I mentioned that this has revolutionized the way I do my work, it's very open-ended. I'm not sure what's down the road in terms of the answers that might emerge or the questions that might emerge, but I think it's a valid way to proceed if we want to learn about ourselves and our history. I think then, having that curiosity and being able to share that curiosity is fundamental. So my last word is just an open invitation, a warm invitation, to have everyone thinking and doing this research themselves too, so thank you for this evening. Thank you for the invitation.
You are very welcome, and thank you again, Professor Achen and Reverend King, for joining us tonight. And thank you to our audience for your participation, for listening, and also just thank you for joining us during this month of February for the Community Faith Partners celebration of Black History Month. We will have our final event on this coming Saturday at 7 p.m. If you're able to join us, that would be great. It's our prayer call, and the theme is A Praying King. We will talk about the prayers of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So we invite you to go to our website at communityfaithpartners.com, and you will have the numbers there. So just come in and join us on Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for 1 hour praying, a praying King. And we'd like to take this moment to thank our sponsors, the Dermatology Associates of Ithaca and Park Foundation, for making this Let's Talk Unity webinar possible. Thank you all, and have a very good evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Okay. I'm going to stop the live stream in a moment, and then I'd just like to leave a